History's the lie agreed upon. Now that aphorism is ascribed to Voltaire, Napoleon Bonaparte, a whole lot of other people. And it's as controversial today, perhaps more so today, than it has been at any other time in the past. I mean, history is history. There ought to be fact and truth, and we ought to know what history is. But as I want to show you today by looking at the Civil War impact here in Westfield, even facts in history are often very, very hard to get. 150 years ago, on May 31st, 1871, the Civil War statue in the center of town was dedicated. That is a historical fact. The main speaker at that dedication was Civil War cavalry general Judson Kilpatrick, a great hero of his time. Today, most biographers looking at him call him General Kill Cavalry. He's usually seen as a braggart and an incompetent. Times change. History changes. Now the sculpture itself, the artist who made it was a man by the name of Mosseman, who had served in the 46th Massachusetts Regiment. It was cast by the Ames Sword Company of Chicopee, Mass. And the model for the statue was Andrew Campbell. He was a captain of Company C in the 46th Mass. Company C was raised among men in Westfield. The statue lists 66 Westfield men who died in the Civil War. And there the historical troubles begin. Now, first of all, Campbell. At the time of his enlistment, he was 33 years old. He was a relatively important local Democratic politician. He was also listed as a blacksmith in some cases and various other craftsmen in other cases. Now, his enlistment and the facts about what happened, because he originally enlisted in Company K of the 10th Massachusetts Regiment, which was raised here in Westfield on April 29, 1861, just 2 weeks after Fort Sumter was fired upon. By the way, that raising of Company K of the 10th Massachusetts Regiment is credited as being the first troops raised for the Civil War in Western Massachusetts. Now, I need to explain what raising troops really means. In April of 1861, the United States Army had 16,000 men in it, and they were scattered in little units all across the American West, generally defending against Indians. The Navy at that time had 8,000 men in it, and they were mostly at sea, all over the Atlantic Ocean. In 1865, 4 years later, nearly 1 million men were enlisted in the United States Armed Forces. However, of that 1 million, only 30,000 were in the regular United States Army, and 50,000 more were in the United States Navy. Nearly 900,000 other soldiers and sailors were in state units, which were loaned to the federal government. During the Civil War, the northern states raised 2,000 different regiments. Now, a regiment was the basic unit of organization in the Civil War. A regiment had 1,000 men organized into 10 companies of 100 each. The companies were lettered A through J. Generally, what would happen is the president would put out a call for troops. In April of 1861, Lincoln called for 75,000 men to enlist for 3 months. Very quickly became clear that wouldn't do it. And so in May, he put out a call for 300,000 men to enlist for 3 years, or the duration of the war. Now the calls would go out to the states, and the number called for or requested would be divided up among the states based on the population of the states. Each governor would then take his assigned portion and divide it up among the towns in that state based on the portions of the towns. Governors would then appoint the senior officers of the regiment, the colonels and the majors. Now, this is one of the reasons there were so many regiments, because this was a great way of political patronage. Governors could reward their friends. If you became a colonel or a major, that was basically a high-paying, prestigious position. You could utilize it for other positions of importance in your communities. What that meant is that regiments that were called up early in the Civil War, generally within a short period of time, got smaller and smaller and smaller. So when you look at Civil War history, you never are quite sure how many men are in a regiment, because it depends on how long they've been in existence. It's more complicated than that, because you didn't have to go if you were called up. Supposedly, each town would then put on an enlistment drive to try and get the number of men to meet its call. Prior to 1863, there was no draft. So you obviously didn't have to go. You had to be persuaded to go. And so what the towns would do was provide a bonus. Over in addition to your pay, you could get extra money. In 1861, most bonuses were between $100 and $150. Now, that's a significant sum of money. A basic worker at that time in the United States would make about $300 a year. So that would be about half the annual wage of a worker in America. Later in the Civil War, those bonuses could get up as high as $200 or $300, equivalent to a year's wages. That led to an obvious problem. A man could enlist in one town, collect his bonus, desert later, and then enlist in another town. By 1864, this became a crisis. Westfield had a quota of 578 men during the Civil War. It actually is credited with 631 enlistments. I'll explain that problem in a minute. And 513 of those men have been identified. Now, Huck Lamb, who was a very famous ex-World War II veteran in town, very involved in veterans affairs, he attempted to identify every veteran of every war in Westfield, and one of his productions was Westfield's 500. This is a list of the 513 men that he could identify as enlisting in the Civil War in Westfield. Company officers, now remember, the governors appoint the regimental officers, the colonels and majors. Company officers, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and corporals, are, at the beginning of the war, elected by the men, because companies were usually raised in localities. So men would best know their own fellows, and they were allowed to elect their own officers. So let's go back to that first company raised in western Massachusetts, Company K of the 10th Massachusetts. The colonel was a man by the name of Briggs from Pittsfield, Mass. Company K was raised in town by 3 men. Milton Whitney, connected with this library, and a prominent attorney in town, one of the most prominent businessmen in town, and Andrew Campbell, who was an important politician from the Democratic Party. The men were raised in one day. This was a great patriotic turnout. The men were then marched to Springfield for their mustering in. That meant to formally swear allegiance to the state and the nation, and they would be formally organized. They got together and they voted a man by the name of Pliny Wood to be the captain. Well, Briggs from Pittsfield, using his political connections, refused to accept that election, and he appointed Andrew Campbell to be the captain of the company. The men revolted. They marched out of Springfield with their weapons and started marching back to Westfield. They weren't going to war unless they had their own man of choice. Briggs ordered other troops from the Springfield area to surround them and arrest them and court-martial them. Cooler heads prevailed, and both Woods and Campbell were removed, and a third man became the captain. Pliny Woods stayed in the company and 2 years later was killed in combat. Andrew Woods took his clothes and went home. He refused to participate any further. A year and a half later, he again enlisted as an officer in the 9-month 46th Regiment. And this 9-month regiment, what those short-term regiments meant were, by the time you had mustered in, gotten some training, and were transferred into the seat of combat, in most cases your term of enlistment was up and you turned around and went back home. The Army did not like short-term regiments. Governors liked short-term regiments because that gave them more basis for patronage. It also gave businessmen in the state more basis for equipage. More regiments means more uniforms, means more swords, more guns, more equipment. Campbell, as I said, enlisted a second time a year and a half into the war. The 46th Regiment was a 9-month regiment. It was mustered in, sent to garrison duty in New Bern, North Carolina. He declared that he was ill, went back home, resigned and went back home, where he was welcomed to great ceremony, and his statue as a hero of Westfield stands to this day in the center of town. He never saw combat. He only was in the service a couple of months, and he was a pure political appointee. Now, that was common. If you were an officer in the Civil War, you could resign. If you got sick or if you didn't like your duty, you could quit and go home. There was no problem with it. Now, you had to start over again if you decided you wanted to enlist later. By the way, you could also change units. You could decide that let's say the infantry didn't suit you and you might want to be in the cavalry. Or in 1864, when black units came around, you could get a great boost. You could go from, say, a captain in a white unit to maybe a major or a colonel in a black unit, and a much higher pay and prestige. So officers had the privilege of coming and going basically at will. That was not true for the lower enlisted ranks. Now, Lamb's list lists 74 dead. By the way, the statue lists only 66 dead. So obviously there's some problem with that. Now, if Huck Lamb's list is correct, that means that roughly 15% of all the men that he identifies enlisting from Westfield died during the Civil War. But first of all, you've got to remove from that 513 the men who enlisted in short-term regiments. Now, during the Civil War, there were 3-month regiments, 90-day men. That meant you usually never left your state at all. There were 9-month regiments. There were 100-day regiments. There were 1-year regiments. There were 2-year regiments. The fighting regiments tended to be 3-year regimental enlistments. So when you look at Civil War service, it really depends on the length of service of the men. If you remove the 3-month and 9-month men from the Westfield list, that's almost 150 men. So of the 513 men who served in the Civil War from Westfield, something like a quarter of them, they raised their hand and swore allegiance and put a uniform on, but they're not veterans of the Civil War by any way we would ordinarily define it. Now, that means that actually nearly 25% of all the longer servicemen died during the Civil War. That's a pretty substantial casualty list. However, most of them are not combat deaths. The Civil War is famous for its level of deaths. Perhaps the numbers keep creeping up even today, over 150 years after the war. They're now talking about combat total deaths as perhaps in the 700,000 range. When I first began learning about the Civil War, it was in the 500,000 range. Most of those deaths were by disease. And the Civil War had a unique factor of that, because a lot of those disease deaths were as prisoners of war, deaths by starvation and disease. Here, for example, is Sergeant Peck of Westfield. This is the before photo of Sergeant Peck, and this is the after photo of Sergeant Peck after he was a prisoner at Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. And Libby was not the worst of the prisons. Andersonville was, and I'll talk about Andersonville and Westfield deaths in a minute. There were 32 combat deaths of the 74 deaths that Huck Lamb identifies from Westfield. 47 of those, or the great bulk of those, took place in 1864. 1864 is really the bloodiest of the Civil War. That's the year of Grant's march to Richmond and Petersburg. In fact, over half of the Westfield deaths took place in just 4 units. 11 died in the 3-year 10th Massachusetts. That unit, those of you familiar with the Civil War will recognize, fought at Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and Cold Harbor, some of the greatest battles of the Civil War. 16 died in the 3-year 27th Massachusetts Regiment. They were sent to North Carolina, where most of the men there died of disease, and then they fought in Grant's campaign to Richmond. They fought at Cold Harbor, etc. 15 died in the 3-year 34th Regiment. They fought in 1864 in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns. 10 died in the luckless 2nd Heavy Artillery. Now, the heavy artillery regiments, and there were a number of them, those were the men who were stationed in the forts around Washington, D.C. That was absolutely soft duty. Men who were assigned there essentially lived in the city of Washington and month after month, year after year, never saw combat, never saw any activity at all. They got fat and soft and lazy. But in 1864, as Grant marched south, he essentially incurred 100,000 casualties in 1 month. The Union Army was desperate for troops, and so they rounded up the men in the heavy artillery units from the forts around Washington and put them into combat. The 2nd Regiment, heavy artillery, had a lot of Westfield men in it. And they were sent into combat in North Carolina, not with Grant. They were not very attuned for war, and they were not very well led. And a large portion of them were captured and made prisoners of war and sent to Andersonville. 275 men from that regiment died at Andersonville, including 10 men from Westfield. Supposedly, this list of dead men should be accurate. But again, we've got a problem with the records. Now, here's an interesting record. This is a record of Company F of the 27th Massachusetts Regiment. Now, the 27th was originally sent to North Carolina and engaged in battles around New Bern and on the North Carolina coast. This company was sent to the little town of Washington, North Carolina. Those of you who have watched these talks may remember that I gave a talk on Philip Peyton, one of the famous black citizens of Westfield. He was originally from that town of Little Washington. And I believe that the reason that that family ended up in Westfield was because of this military unit. Anyway, they captured the office of the newspaper, where there was a printing press. And so the men, and we have a copy, original copy of this broadside that they produced, which is a list of all the men in the company, including those who resigned, who were discharged, transferred, died, and even a couple of deserters. And this was their record of the company they produced. One of the men brought it home, and we have it here in the Athenaeum. They also had a picture taken of their band. This picture was taken in North Carolina. They're not a very martial-looking group of men, but you have to realize that Civil War regiments and Civil War organization was scruffy. They didn't look very professional much of the time. The question is that list of dead men accurate? Now, let's keep in mind, May 31st, 1871, the monument is dedicated in a big public ceremony. Surrounding the monument are living veterans, the men who have come home from war. Here they are. They are the men who have just gone through the Civil War. They are the men who knew the men whose names are on the monument. They should know exactly what the facts are about the monument. However, Francis Carroll's name is on the monument. All Civil War written records show him not as dead, but as discharged and leaving the area. Alicia Griggs, Lysander Nichols, and 3 other names on the monument show no connection to Westfield at all. Their enlistment records show them from other towns. There is no information in Westfield showing that they worked in Westfield, lived in Westfield, enlisted from Westfield. They don't seem to be here at all. Now, what they may be, remember, if you go back to where I was a few minutes ago, remember I said Westfield had 500 odd men that were required, but they actually produced 613. What you could do is a man could be recruited from another town, paid a bonus, and he would sign up and he would be credited to Westfield as fulfilling the Westfield credits. This meant that a Westfield man did not have to enlist. You could get somebody from somewhere else. By the way, this was commonly done for immigrants getting off the boat in New York City and Boston. You would go to an Irish immigrant who didn't have anything waiting for him, persuade him that the army was a wonderful choice, give him a bonus money, get him drunk and sign him up. And suddenly he might find out that he supposedly was a resident of Westfield, Massachusetts, enlisting in a unit from Westfield, Massachusetts, when he'd never heard of the place. As in 1864, when black soldiers were recruited, they were also assigned to these towns, and Massachusetts is gathered up almost 400 Southern ex-slaves and assigned them to towns in Massachusetts. So it may be that that's what these men were. They certainly, although their names are on the monument, they're not from Westfield. Albert Brewer's name is dead on the monument. The records say that he was from Worcester, not from Westfield. But he was in the 2nd Heavy Artillery Unit with the rest of the Westfield men and died at Andersonville. So it's quite possible that his surviving buddies put his name up there. Well, if that's true, then how do you explain Shepard Proven? Now, Shepard Proven was from Westfield. His family was from Westfield. He enlisted from Westfield. He served in the 2nd Heavy Artillery. He was captured in North Carolina. He died in Andersonville with the rest of his buddies. He's buried in Andersonville. His grave is there. His name is not on the monument. Now, there were men standing around that monument that day on May 31st who knew Shepard Proven. They knew his name was not there. What is the fact of why? You probably don't know and can't know, but the facts don't fit. We've got a further problem with these enlistments and records. Of the 74 names on the monument, only 4 are representative of any of the old established names in Westfield, or the names that survive in Westfield to this day. By the way, that holds true for the 513. The establishment did not serve in the Civil War. During the Civil War, the Westfield had a population of about 5,000 men. When the draft was established in 1863, it was determined that about 900 men were, by age and physical condition, eligible for the draft. In theory, 513 of them served, although, as I've already pointed out, some of the names don't seem to be Westfield men. Now, of the 513, 142 men, or roughly a quarter, were 21 or younger, the kind of men that serve in the armed forces. However, only 1 was under 18. For all the stories about boy soldiers in the Civil War, and there are a lot of them. And by the way, I should tell you that there are a number of newspaper stories from the 1920s and early 30s of old Civil War veterans still living in town. It was a common thing around Memorial Day to go out and get an old veteran and interview him. And at least a half dozen of them claimed to have been 13, 14, or 15 when they enlisted. We can today check their birth and death records and No, it's an old coot reminiscing and trying to make himself sound bigger and more important than he was 60, 70 years earlier. However, 101 men, or about 20%, were older than 30. Now, that's not something you see in modern armed forces. Men of that age are considered to be over the hill for the difficulties of combat, and in the Civil War, the difficulties were worse than they are in the contemporary armed forces. Most of the men were workers. In Huck's list, he's been able to identify the employment of almost all of the 513. 9 were professional or businessmen. All of them were officers. There were 2 school teachers, and there were 10 college students. The rest were almost all things like whip makers and draymen, that means men who drove horses, and blacksmiths and cobblers and machinists. They were working class men. They are mostly men who tend to be of non-Yankee families. A lot of them are families of recent immigrants. And that was quite common in the Civil War. And by the way, it was common in the Revolutionary War too. After the initial revolutionary fervor of the first year or two, most of the revolutionary armed forces after that were made up of the lowest of the low and the youngest of the youngest and the men with the least commitments. The establishment adults in general and the establishment classes in particular did not serve. If they did, it was in the first year of the war and as officers and as short time. Examples are Andrew Campbell, who probably had a total of 3 months service. Lucius Wakely, the prominent businessman who helped raise the original troops, he was appointed captain for the original muster of that Company K of the 10th. He resigned as soon as the men were called up. Later in the war, he joined that famous 46th 9-month men, and he made it all the way to North Carolina for garrison duty, but he got word there that his wife was sick, so he resigned and came home. For the rest of his life in town, he was Captain Wakely, and he was honored on and on as one of the great representatives of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic in Westfield. Campbell, by the way, became the first head when the local GAR chapter was created. He became the original president of the chapter. There's also a problem with the records of the names. Chauncey R. Gross was a whipmaker in town. He enlisted, but not as Chauncey R. Gross. He enlisted as Chauncey R. Chauncey. I don't know why. For the rest of his life in town, that's who he was, Chauncey R. Chauncey. And then there's the Andrews problem. Now, some of the first names in Huck Lamb's list are Leroy Andrews, Lyman Andrews, Luman Andrus, and Putt Andrus. If you look at the service records of these apparent 4 men, it's clear they're not 4 men at all. They might be 2 men, or they might be 1 man. In fact, it kind of looks like this may be one of those deserters who enlisted at one time in one place as Leroy Andrews, and maybe he was an immigrant, and enlisted in another place at another time as Luman Andrus and served in the Navy. But it's clear from all of the other statistics around that we're either dealing with one man or perhaps brothers. We don't know. You've got to keep in mind these records are handwritten records. The records originally are taken down by company sergeants. They're taken down by enlisted men, many of whom are semi-literate themselves. They're taken down in pencil, and then they're copied and recopied and recopied. There are errors all over the place. There's other problems with the records. There is newspaper coverage of the Civil War. I mean, it's the biggest thing in America. In many ways, it's one of the biggest things that ever happened in America. There is a newspaper, a daily newspaper in town. There's surprisingly little coverage of the Civil War. Yes, major battles get written up afterwards. But other than that, there's surprisingly little coverage. Oh, there are patriotic speeches from time to time, and there is fundraising to support the troops. What's not mentioned is when the war was over with, there was a strong political push in Massachusetts to pay the towns back for the money they had spent supporting the troops. And in fact, that was done. Not only was the money sent back to the towns, but it was given back to the individuals who had made donations. So much of the great patriotic fundraising that was done during the Civil War was reimbursed, so people didn't even get their pockets hurt. Along that same line, patriotism in Westfield was always tempered. In 1860, in the original vote that brought Lincoln to the White House, 25% of the votes in Westfield went for the Southern breakaway candidacy of Breckinridge, the pro-slavery, pro-states' rights movement. As late as 1864, when Lincoln is up for election again, he just barely carries the city of Westfield. Over 40% of the votes in Westfield went to McClellan, the Democratic candidate who was for ending the war and letting the South go and ending the steps of abolition. There is a very strong sentiment in Westfield throughout the war opposing the war. It's long been forgotten. In 1922, the veterans of the Civil War in Westfield, their ranks had once been hundreds. The local GAR post had 400 men in it at its peak, dwindled down to these precious few. This was their last call, their last meeting. The men were in their 80s and 90s as they gathered in front of the Park Square Hotel on the Green in Westfield. In 1937, Charles Waite, the last veteran in Westfield, died. Charles Waite, by the way, is one of those men who claimed he enlisted at 15. And, interestingly enough, Charles Waite, whose obituary says he was brought up in Westfield, enlisted in Westfield, was wounded in the last period of the war, stayed in the local Westfield GAR unit, and died as the last GAR veteran in Westfield, does not appear on Huck Lamb's list because he is not included in the state and national records as a Civil War veteran. History, even patriotic history, is rather like sausage making. It's good and enjoyable, but you probably don't want to look too closely at the processes by which it's made.